The main idea of the offshore floating nuclear plant concept is to integrate a nuclear reactor in a floating platform of the type commonly used in oil and gas offshore operations. And so it's essentially a marriage of two mature and established technologies. You have reactors, nuclear reactors of the light water reactor type on one side, and you have floating structures, which, like I said, are being used routinely for exploration and production of oil and gas fields offshore. And you realize a new nuclear power plant concept that has some very interesting, attractive features. So let's start with the economic side of it. The idea would be to build the whole plant, not just the reactor, not just the platform, in a shipyard. When you build things in a shipyard or in a factory as opposed to out in the field, the construction is a lot more streamlined. There are some very nice cost savings that come from a controlled environment that you can attain in a factory or in a shipyard versus the field where everything has to be kind of built up from scratch. So we feel that with the shipyard construction approach, the construction time and the construction cost of nuclear power plants can be very, very significantly reduced. And therefore that will lower the barrier to overcome if, say, a country or a company want to build a new plant. So there are other interesting characteristics of the shipyard construction. This would be a plant that is, like I said, built in a shipyard and then is floated out to the site. The site is the ocean itself, so this is a floating plant which is going to essentially be located offshore, and it's connected to the electrical grid by means of a power cable, and that's how it supplies essentially electricity to the grid. Now, when the lifetime of the plant itself expires, the idea is that you would bring the whole plant back to a centralized shipyard where you can do decommissioning. So again, in terms of intrusiveness, if you wish, of the plant at the site, it's minimized by the fact that this is a mobile plant. So it's brought in, and when its lifetime sort of expires, it's taken away right away. So you don't have, at the back end of the project, you do not have a lengthy decommissioning activity that could take for land or terrestrial plants of the order of a decade. Also, on the economic side, this concept affords the possibility of moving the power plant from one market to another. So if the local market conditions change such that nuclear power in that particular market is no longer profitable for whatever reason in 10 or 20 years, then the customer or the owner of the plant has the possibility of literally moving it to a different market, to a different location, where that plant would be profitable. So this is important because the typical lifetime of nuclear power plants is of the order of 60. Some people are now thinking of maybe extending it even to 80 years. And it's very difficult to plan 40, 60, 80 years ahead. Nobody can really predict what the market conditions are going to be that far in advance. So providing this flexibility to the customer is important to essentially increase the value of the asset over the long period of time. So we talked about economics. Now let me move on to safety, which is the other big sort of selling point for the concept. First of all, it is a floating reactor, and it's offshore. So the fact that it's floating, it means that it's not susceptible to earthquakes, as a precursors to accidents. Essentially, if the bottom of the ocean moves due to a seismic event, that energy is not transferred to the plant itself, so the plant doesn't really shake, and that's a major advantage with respect to terrestrial plants, which are more subject to obviously to seismic loads, if you wish. It is also immune to tsunamis, and I'm mentioning earthquakes and tsunamis because those were the two precursor events for the Fukushima disaster, which of course is on everybody's mind. In fact, if I may take a step back, I would say that the safety philosophy for the offshore floating nuclear plant concept is derived almost directly from the lessons learned in the Fukushima accident. I myself was part of the American Nuclear Society Special Committee on Fukushima, so I had a chance to really study the accident in great details. And from a technical point of view, of course, there are some lessons learned that we're trying to now implement in this new concept. So, no earthquakes, no tsunamis. You may wonder why not tsunamis, because after all, it's in the ocean. In offshore location, if the depth of the water is sufficient, essentially tsunami waves are very low amplitude, and so there are no concern. Essentially, the whole structure floats up with the wave or moves up with the wave, and then it relaxes back. What you need is a mooring system that provides enough slack for that motion to take place, but that's commonly done with offshore platforms. So elimination of earthquakes and tsunamis is the first advantage that we see. There is also the ability to provide cooling to the reactor indefinitely and passively, as we say, which means without external intervention, because essentially the nuclear reactor, or the nuclear island as we call it, is below the water line, and it makes it fairly easy to connect via heat exchangers to the ocean, which is an essentially infinite heat sink. And so the ocean water provides the cooling, the emergency cooling to the reactor, and essentially you don't run into problems related to lack of cooling of the fuel or the core, which typically lead to fuel damage and then ultimately can lead to a release into the environment. So there are some fairly substantial advantages for this concept in terms of safety, which would not be available for terrestrial plants.